wish to... Yep, thank you. Yep. Okay, everyone works differently, so thank you, Minister. I call the member for Banks.
Well, thank you, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, and my questions are also to the Minister and relate to the administration of the NBN and indeed the contrast between the administration or lack thereof under the previous government and under this government. So, Minister, just in the broad context of the NBN, as I understand it, is that this was a project conceived in mid-air in the absence of a cost-benefit analysis or indeed much analysis of any kind at all. And I wanted to focus. And I wanted to.
Order.
I wanted to focus in particular, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, on the financial contribution of the government to the NBN. Now, my understanding, Minister, is that the previous government originally announced that there would be a $4.7 billion contribution prior to the 2007 election in the context of a total project spend of $10 billion. But I further understand that some years later, in 2009, the government said that the project cost had in fact increased to $43 billion and that private investors and mums and dads were encouraged to invest up to 49% of that $43 billion. And indeed, I understand that the member for Lilly at that time said, and I quote, "There couldn't be a better investment." That is my understanding of what the member for Lilly said. There couldn't be a better investment than the NBN. Now, of course, as I understand it, Minister, the Prime Minister at the time stepped forward with a sort of faux FDR gravitas to announce a new deal for broadband, but of course that new deal turned out to be a very, very bad deal for everyone except perhaps a few telecommunications companies that might have outwitted the previous government in negotiations. I also understand, Minister, that the rollout of this project was dramatically over budget and behind schedule. My understanding is that $6.5 billion was spent prior to the 2010 election to reach just 3% of Australians, which seems an extraordinary figure, and almost, Minister, a rollout by press release as opposed to a rollout by substance, and clearly with some premature announcements, donning of high visibility gear, perhaps before it was necessary, Minister, and frankly a very, very poor scenario. Now, Minister, I also wanted to confirm that my understanding is that the previous government had never actually undertaken an exercise to determine where broadband was in fact most needed, and that was quite a startling understanding when I first came to that knowledge. And also, indeed, that at one point the previous government in fact claimed that access to the NBN under them would be free. And again, given that as I understand it, the total cost of the project was going to be about $72 billion, which is about $8,000 per Australian household, plus the requirement for people to pay $100 plus to access it, it would seem to me that that description of the project as being free was certainly misleading. So in that context, Minister, some specific questions. Firstly, what did the strategic review, which was recently conducted, reveal to be the true state of NBN Co? What is the true financial position of NBN Co as opposed to the perhaps less accurate descriptions that we were used to under the previous government? What's the broadband quality project, and how was it conducted, and has it been helpful in, for the first time, actually identifying where broadband is in most need? And importantly, why is it important to both serve underserved areas for the NBN, and also focus on areas that are in fact promising for revenue.
The member, call again the member for Minister, you'd like to respond to that? Yes.
Yeah, well, I'll deal with both of those questions. Firstly, briefly to the member for Blaxland. I understand his interest in the anti-siphoning list. It's something that everyone's very keenly interested in. It tends to be amended regularly, or not irregular. It tends to be amended every few years as circumstances change. We don't have any plans to make any changes to it, but we are certainly in a process of engaging with the broadcasting sector and talking about regulatory reform generally. He also asked, would I guarantee that all changes to broadcasting law would be part of one package? That is certainly what at least one network has argued should be the case. That's a perfectly reasonable proposition to make, and that is all under consideration. We're being very, very transparent in our discussions with the media sector, and given the engaging and convivial nature of the participants, I'm sure that our discussions will rapidly come to the knowledge of most members of the public. Now, turning to the member for Banks's question about the NBN, he has described very well the very sorry state of this project and its development. The truth is that the Labor government started off with a conventional approach to broadband, in the conventional by global standards, in the sense of proposing to get the private sector to upgrade the national network and to provide a subsidy to ensure that uneconomic areas got a service. And that's in one form or another, that's the norm pretty well everywhere. Then, when that tender, as it were, didn't work out, there was this enormous leap into what is a unique, hitherto untried approach for any major country to have the government build an entirely new broadband network in a start-up company. And that was the fundamental mistake. The next big mistake they made was specifying one access technology instead of specifying or promising a service level and being flexible about technology. And as the honourable member asked, the consequence of this has been a colossal failure. Very little progress has been made, a huge amount of money has been committed, and when we took over government in September, we undertook a strategic review, or arranged for the NBN Co to undertake a strategic review, and it was designed to find out what was the current state of the project and what were our options. Well, the current state of the project is that if the Labor government's policy was continued, business as usual, the peak funding requirement would be $72.6 billion, or $28.5 billion more than forecast. The consequence of that, naturally, would be that broadband prices would have to go up to 80% more on average. You cannot have a massively overcapitalised government monopoly, or monopoly of any kind, and expect it to do anything other than put prices up. So a shocking lose-lose for both the taxpayer and the consumer. The review examined why these problems had occurred, why the delays had occurred, and they identified a number of cultural issues which were very interesting. They noted that within the NBN Co there was a sort of a groupthink, a blind faith in the achievability of the corporate plan, notwithstanding clear factual evidence to the contrary. As the honourable member pointed out, and as the NBN Co's current management have pointed out, the previous approach was not so much fibre to the premises as fibre to the press release. And what they were seeking to do was to pass as many premises with fibre as they could, so they could say, we've passed X thousand premises, and they missed all those targets, without actually taking care to ensure that those premises could be connected, with the extraordinary consequence that in some areas which were declared ready for service, only a very small percentage, in some cases less than 10%, were actually able to get a connection if they had rung up, because all the rest didn't have a lead-in and were either service class 0 or service class 1s. And so it's been a catastrophic mess, and I'll have the opportunity later to explain what we're doing to clean it up.
Thank you, Minister. Your time's expired. I call again the member. Order. I call again the member for Blaxland.
Much, and it's disappointing that of all of the ministers in this government, the last I'd expect to have to hide behind backbenchers in an environment like this is Malcolm Turnbull. I'm honestly disappointed. I'm honestly disappointed.
Order.
I'm honestly so disappointed.
I'd ask the minister to resume his seat. Thank you. Order. Order. Member for Blaxland. Order. Member for Blaxland, I'd ask you to refer to the minister's correct title in the minute you have. Okay. You have the call.
Well, let's see if the minister can answer this question without having to wait and think about the answer while he's receiving another diatribe from one of his backbenchers. Minister, you've previously said that you do not propose to pay Telstra anything for access or ownership of their copper network. You've said, "I'm very confident." This is a quote. "I'm very confident that we can acquire access, ownership, if you like, of the last mile of copper for no additional payment." Are you still confident that you will get the copper for no additional payment? Can you please give me an answer to that question?
Call the minister.
What I'll do, Mr. Acting Deputy Speaker, to gratify the wishes of the courageous gentleman opposite, what I will do is I'll answer all of his questions, which will mean that more time will be taken up with me on my feet and he'll have less opportunity to ask questions. So, usual self-defeating approach. Okay.
Order. The minister's got order. The minister has the call. Order.
Yes or no?
The answer to the question is as follows. The previous government, in entering into its arrangements with Telstra, and similar deal with Optus, basically agreed to pay a gigantic sum, tens and tens of billions of dollars, over a long period, to Telstra in return for switching off, decommissioning its copper network and its hybrid fibre coax network insofar as it was used for broadband data or voice, and similar arrangements with Optus. In entering into those arrangements, entering into those arrangements, Mr. Acting Deputy Speaker, the previous government, in what can only be described as one of the most self-wounding, stupid, political betrayals of the public interest, chose to take no option over the legacy infrastructure they were paying Telstra to switch over. You would think, if you were going to pay billions and billions of dollars to Telstra to switch off its copper, you would think that you would say, and by the way, I want to have the option to use some or all of it myself if I choose to do so. That's what any rational business person would do. But they didn't do that because they ran this project politically. They turned fibre to the premises, which is just one access technology, into an ideological cult, and they were determined to make it as hard as possible for any subsequent government to take a more rational approach. Now,
members to my left, order. You've asked a question. The minister is answering it. The minister is answering the question. Order. Thank you, Minister.
I am confident that we can achieve the objectives described in the quote the honourable member for Blaxland gave, but we are in negotiations. We are in negotiations with Telstra about it, and the negotiations are progressing well. But you know, these things are you can only say they will be completed when they're over. That's the reality. But they are progressing well, and all I can say, Mr. Acting Deputy Speaker, is the culpable recklessness of the previous government in not taking an option over those legacy assets was extraordinary. It was a political decision. It was designed to hamper any future government in its flexibility, and it was a classic case, yet again, of politics, Labor Party politics in this case, putting the financial future of this country at risk. Yet another reckless, wasteful decision, a completely unbusinesslike decision. The simple truth is this: that in every other jurisdiction of a comparable country, what telcos are doing, what carriers are doing, is upgrading their broadband networks, or that's happening everywhere. And they are using a mix of technologies, and they're using whatever is cost-effective. And as the new hybrid technologies are becoming more effective, as vectored VDSL can now deliver 100 megs, who would have thought that 5 or 6 years ago? As G.fast is delivering a gig, who would imagine that was possible over a hybrid network? All of these technologies are becoming available, and they are all being deployed in a rational way. This crazy Labor government, and that was thrown out of office last year, did its utmost to ensure that the NBN could not be completed in a rational way, and we are hard at work to ensure that it is completed rationally, prudently and in the best interests of both taxpayers and consumers.
I call the member for Swan.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. As we heard earlier in the week in question time when I spoke to the Minister about had a question about some NBN issues in my electorate, but just to remind the Minister that back in 2010, during the election, lead up to the election there, we were promised by the promises made to the people of Swan about the rollout of NBN in Victoria Park that would commence in June 2011. That actually took a fair time to come to fruition, and they started to roll out in October 2012. So it was just another poor performance by the NBN in their process of rolling things out. Yeah, and the actual area that is amazing to me, and is probably the Minister can enlighten me on part of the processes of what the selection for and allocation of NBN projects was for, because many people in the electorate at that particular time thought it was a purely political allocation to Victoria Park, because there were plenty of areas that had more need, but the member or the candidate for the Labor Party at that time obviously was focusing on Victoria Park and thought that that was be the area where he could get the most bang for his buck from the NBN. At the particular time, in lead up to the election, the EMRC had actually made a fantastic submission on behalf of the area of Belmont to the Minister, and the Minister had actually come out and said that it was a fantastic submission and he thought it would merited definite looking at, but it never got a mention, and all of a sudden it went. The allocation or the NBN project rollout was put in for Victoria Park, and you know what? Victoria Park hadn't even put a submission in. Can you believe it? Now, how does that process work? We're an area where there's enormous need for improvement in broadband facilities near the airport as well, where it has a fantastic industrial area and plenty of, as we know, it's near the freight hub of Western Australia as well for both road and rail. The Minister overlooked a fantastic submission by the EMRC and allocated it to an area where there was no submission made, and if the Minister at some stage could enlighten what maybe that process of the allocations of the NBN was in Western Australia. And as you know, you've been to the electorate before. There's we went looking for NBN in Victoria Park, and we struggled to find it. We saw plenty of signs that they had been there, but it was a bit like a hunt for the elusive Scarlet Pimpernel. But there was plenty of action. Cynthia was saying they were doing things, and I know there was plenty of subcontractors who were saying they weren't getting paid by Cynthia. And we also had the issue in Teague Street, where Teague Street was dug up 6 times by the NBN contractor, and there was enormous damage done to their property. There was done to the areas within the scope of the town of Victoria Park as well to repair, and the Cynthia contractors left that. Now, I just wonder if the Minister can advise us what in the processes or what steps you've taken in the process to ensure that these sort of things don't happen again during the NBN process, that the people, good people like who in my electorate, who in Teague Street had to suffer enormous and complete damage by the contractors, which was overlooked by which was overseen by the previous government. And we also saw that there was an asbestos issue within the electorate as well, where there was actual asbestos pit dug up. It was left. There was some left on the ground. There was people who came to clean it up without the right protective gear. There was no oversight by the NBN for any safety or concerns for the workers who had to do that. There was no regulations in place, and Cynthia at that stage took about 10 months to reply to that. So just if the Minister can also advise what steps you've taken to make sure that those processes or those dangers to the workers and the people who are doing the NBN contract are not subject to those sort of dangers again from the the NBN and dealing with asbestos. So if the Minister could enlighten me on those, it would be fantastic.
Thank you, member. Give the call to the Minister.
For their question, just dealing with the member for Greenway's question, the best forecast we have for premises with access to 25 megs by 2016 remains the strategic review, although that will of course be superseded in due course by the new corporate plan, which is in the process of preparation. And I prefer the honourable member and anyone watching this discussion here that it forecasts that by 2016, 43% of the fixed line footprint, that is 43% of 93%, will have 25 megabits per second, access to 25 megabits per second. There will obviously be other premises outside the NBN footprint which will have more than 25 megabits per second, although it's hard to identify what that percentage is. And it was expected that if the fixed wireless build is completed or substantially completed by that stage, and of course if the satellites are deployed by that stage, the people covered by that will have 25 megs. By 2019, the strategic review forecasts under the Scenario 6, the optimised multi-technology mix, that 91% of premises in the fixed line footprint would have 50 megs, and of that fixed line footprint by that time, 65 to 75% of the fixed line footprint would have 100 megabits per second. Now, I should say that in terms of access to speeds, the technologies are improving all the time. The ability to get higher and higher speeds out of a connection which consists for the last few hundred metres of copper is getting better all the time, and that is why, for example, the Deutsche Telekom, for example, which had started off with a very ambitious substantial fibre-to-the-premises rollout, has stopped it and is now overwhelmingly concentrating on a VDSL deployment because of the cost. Look, you'll get your turn. You'll get your turn. You're not helping yourself, and you're not helping any of these proceedings by being so disorderly. Okay. Now, turning to my friend, the member for Swan's question, the rollout of the NBN in Western Australia has been a disaster. It was, at the time of the election, there were only a handful of premises connected. The work had basically stopped. The contractors that had been engaged, or the contracting consortium, Cynthia, had dropped down tools. It had been a failure. Getting that back on track has been very difficult, but it is underway. The most, it's often said that you can have the best business plan in the world. The NBN did not have the best business plan in the world, but if you don't have the right people, it's never going to work. We do now have a much, much better executive team at NBN Co. The Chief Operating Officer, Greg Adcock, is one of the most experienced telecom network engineers in the country, obviously from Telstra. and Greg is pulling all of this back into getting all this into hand. So things are moving again in terms of the NBN in Western Australia, but it's challenging. I say to honourable members, and I think we all know this from our experience, that it is much harder getting a project that has failed or that has been mismanaged back on track than it is to get a new project from a greenfield start on track. So there is massive cultural change required at NBN Co, but I'm very confident with new management, new CEO Bill Morrow. And Bill Morrow is a man who has not only run telecom companies in many countries, but he's actually built a large telecom network. He's been responsible for building a large telecom network. That's the type of experience you need in a project like this. It's always going to be very difficult to accomplish, but we now have a much better team than we did before, and I'm confident that we'll get the project back on track.